In the heart of ancient Israel, during a time of divided kingdoms and restless hearts, a prophet named Elisha walked among God's people, carrying a message of hope and power. Welcome to the story of the floating axe head, found in 2 Kings 6:1-7, a tale that reveals God's extraordinary care in the midst of ordinary struggles. Imagine a land torn by conflict, yet alive with faith, where Elisha's ministry shone as a beacon of divine truth. His disciples, known as the sons of the prophets, lived together in devotion, learning to listen for God's voice in a world that often drowned it out. Picture a serene riverside along the Jordan, its gentle waters reflecting the golden light of dawn. Here, the sons of the prophets built their lives, not just homes, but a community rooted in worship and service. They were young men of purpose, bound by a shared calling to follow God's path under Elisha's guidance. Their days were filled with prayer, study, and labor, a testament to their trust in the God who led them. The Jordan River, a sacred thread in Israel's story, stretched before them, whispering memories of miracles past parted waters, delivered promises. But what happens when faith meets a problem that seems impossible? When the tools you rely on slip away and the waters of life threaten to swallow your hope? This is the question at the heart of our story, one that begins with a simple need and ends with a miracle that defies reason. A lost axe head, a desperate cry, and a prophet who points to God's power. These are the threads of a moment that still speaks to us today. Join us on this journey as we uncover the wonder of God's provision. Subscribe to Biblical Journey on YouTube for more stories that bring Scripture to life. And let's step into this tale together, where a single miracle along the Jordan reveals a God who sees, hears, and acts. Stay with us, the axe head is about to float. In the quiet rhythm of life along the Jordan, the sons of the prophets faced a challenge as ordinary as it was urgent. Their home, a modest haven where they studied, prayed, and grew under Elisha's steady guidance, could no longer hold them. The walls that once sheltered their dreams now pressed in, too narrow for their growing numbers. These young men, bound by faith in a shared calling, refused to let discomfort stifle their purpose. Instead, they saw a chance to build something new, a space where their community could thrive, their devotion to God unhindered. Picture the scene, a circle of earnest faces, their voices blending in the soft morning light. The sons of the prophets stood before Elisha, their teacher and guide, with a proposal born of necessity. "Master," one spoke, his tone respectful yet firm, "the place where we live is too small. Our quarters are crowded, our work constrained. Let us go to the Jordan, where the trees stand tall, and cut timber to build a new home, a place where we can grow, learn, and serve God more fully." The others nodded, their eyes alight with hope. This was no fleeting idea. It was a vision shaped by unity, a collective dream to honor their calling. Elisha listened, his presence calm and grounding, as the young men shared their need. Their humility was striking. Not one demanded, not one grumbled. They approached their prophet with reverence, seeking his wisdom before taking a single step. This was a community that valued guidance, that paused to seek God's direction in the face of practical problems. In their words, you could hear the pulse of stewardship, a commitment to use what God had given them wisely, to build not for personal gain, but for His glory. They sought no luxury, only space to continue their work, to live out their faith without the limits of their cramped home. That home told a story of its own. Imagine narrow rooms where scrolls and tools jostled for space, where every corner held the traces of shared lives. The walls, worn by time and use, seemed to whisper their need for change. Yet within those tight confines, the sons of the prophets flourished on camaraderie. They laughed together, wrestled with Scripture together, knelt in prayer together. Their unity was their strength, a bond forged in the fire of their shared purpose. Now that unity fueled their dream of something bigger, a place where their community could expand, where their calling could take deeper root. Elisha's response was brief but weighty. "Go," he said, his voice carrying the quiet assurance of divine approval. But the young men, ever mindful of their teacher's role, pressed further. "Please come with us," they urged. "Your presence will guide us. Your wisdom will keep us steady." Elisha's eyes softened, warmed by their trust. "I will come," he promised, and with those words their plan gained a sacred dimension. The prophet's agreement was more than consent. It was a sign that God himself stood with them, that their simple need had found favor in his sight. Excitement rippled through the group as they prepared for their task. They spoke of the Jordan, its banks lined with sturdy trees ready to be shaped into beams. The river, a lifeline in their land, offered not just water, but resources, timber strong enough to frame a new home. Their enthusiasm was contagious, each man eager to play his part. Some envisioned the logs they'd cut, others the walls they'd raise. They weren't just building a structure, they were crafting a legacy, a place where future prophets could gather, learn, and carry God's message forward. This moment, though rooted in practicality, carried a deeper resonance. The sons of the prophets faced a challenge familiar to many: the strain of outgrowing their current space, whether physical, emotional, or spiritual. Their response was a testament to faith in action, humble, collaborative, and anchored in prayer. They didn't rush ahead or lean on their own understanding. Instead, they turned to Elisha, seeking the wisdom of one who walked closely with God. Their story whispers to us across time, urging us to pause in our own challenges, to seek God's guidance before we act, to trust that even the most ordinary needs matter to Him. As they set their sights on the Jordan, the sons of the prophets carried more than tools and plans. They carried a vision of what could be a community strengthened by shared purpose, a home where God's work could flourish. But the path ahead held risks. The Jordan's waters ran deep, its currents unpredictable. The task of felling trees and shaping beams demanded skill and care. In their zeal, they couldn't yet see the trial waiting, a moment that would test their faith in ways they never expected. Their journey to expand their home was about more than space. It was about trust in each other, in Elisha, and above all, in the God who had called them. They show us that the answer to life's constraints lies not in striving alone, but in coming together, in lifting our needs to God with open hearts. Their unity, their humility, their willingness to seek direction, these were the true foundations of what was to come. And so, with Elisha's blessing, they prepared to move forward. The Jordan beckoned, its trees standing tall, ready to be transformed. The sons of the prophets didn't know it yet, but their simple plan was on the cusp of an extraordinary moment, a moment where faith would meet the impossible, and God's power would break through. For now they walked in hope, their hearts full of purpose, their steps guided by the prophet who led them. The journey had begun, and the story was just unfolding. With their hearts set on a new beginning, the sons of the prophets embarked on a journey that would test their faith in ways they could not yet imagine. Under Elisha's steady guidance, they left behind the cramped quarters of their old home and set out for the Jordan River, where the promise of sturdy timber awaited. The air was alive with purpose, each step a testament to their shared vision of a larger space to serve God. This was no ordinary task. It was a pilgrimage of trust, a collective act of obedience to the call they felt deep in their souls. The path to the Jordan was not an easy one. Picture a rugged landscape where dusty trails wound through rocky hills and sparse patches of green. The sun beat down on the group as they walked, their sandals stirring clouds of earth with every stride. Yet the weight of the journey did nothing to dim their spirits. Laughter and conversation wove through the air, the sons of the prophets bound by a camaraderie that made the miles feel lighter. They swapped stories, shared hopes, and leaned on each other, their unity a living reflection of the community they sought to build. One might jest about the blisters forming on his feet, only to be met with a playful nudge and a promise of rest by the river. This was a brotherhood forged in faith, each man carrying the other's burdens as easily as his own. At the head of the group walked Elisha, his presence a quiet anchor amidst their lively chatter. His steps were measured, his gaze steady, exuding an authority that needed no proclamation. The sons of the prophets looked to him not just as a teacher, but as a conduit of God's power, a man who had seen the divine move in ways that defied explanation. As they walked, memories of Elisha's past miracles flickered in their minds. There was the time he purified the poisoned waters of Jericho, turning death into life with a handful of salt. Or the moment he multiplied a widow's oil, filling jars from a single flask to save her from ruin. These were not mere stories. They were proofs of God's hand on Elisha, and they filled the group with confidence that their journey was under his care. The Jordan River, their destination, held a sacred place in the heart of Israel. Its waters had seen wonders that echoed through generations. Long ago, Joshua led the Israelites across its parted waves, their feet touching dry ground as God held back the flood. The prophets among them might have recalled Elijah, Elisha's own mentor, striking the Jordan with his cloak to cross on dry land before being swept to heaven in a chariot of fire. The river was more than a source of timber. It was a stage for God's miracles, a place where the impossible became real. As the group drew closer, the Jordan's gentle rush grew louder, its banks shimmering under the midday sun. The sons of the prophets felt the weight of its history, sensing that their own story was about to intertwine with its legacy. Their purpose was clear: to fell trees and gather wood for their new home. Each man carried tools, their axes glinting with the promise of hard work. They spoke of the task ahead, imagining the beams they'd shape, the walls they'd raise. The Jordan's trees were strong, their roots drinking deep from the river's life. But the river itself was no tame ally. Its currents could be swift, its depths unforgiving. As they walked, a quiet undercurrent of risk lingered in their minds, not fear, but a sober awareness that their work would demand care. The axes they carried were borrowed, their iron heads precious in a time when such tools were costly. To lose one would be no small matter, a debt hard to repay. Elisha's presence steadied them. He walked not as a distant leader, but as one of them, his robe catching the dust of the trail. The sons of the prophets drew strength from his calm, knowing he carried God's wisdom into every step. Their trust in him mirrored their trust in God, a trust that had led them to leave their old home, to dream of something greater, and now to tread this rugged path. They were preparing not just for a day's labor, but for a moment that would mark their faith. The Jordan was near, its waters calling them forward, but the journey itself was already shaping them, teaching them to rely on God's guidance through every challenge. As they crested a final hill, the Jordan came into view, its surface catching the light like a ribbon of silver. The sons of the prophets quickened their pace, their voices rising with anticipation. They could almost feel the weight of the axe in their hands, the rhythm of their swings against the trees. But beneath their eagerness, a subtle tension stirred. The river's beauty hid its power, its depths a mystery that could swallow more than their hopes if they weren't careful. They didn't know it yet, but one swing of an axe would soon change everything, turning their labor into a cry for help and their journey into a miracle. This trek to the Jordan was about more than timber or a new home. It was about preparation, preparing their hearts to trust God in the work ahead, preparing their hands to act in faith. The sons of the prophets carried a vision, but they also carried vulnerability. Their borrowed tools, their rugged path, their reliance on Elisha all pointed to a truth they were learning, that God's plans often unfold in the tension between effort and surrender. As they neared the river, they stood on the edge of something greater than they could see, a moment where their trust would be tested and God's power revealed. The Jordan waited, its waters whispering of miracles past and promises yet to come. The sons of the prophets, with Elisha at their side, were ready to begin. Their journey had brought them here, united in purpose, grounded in faith. But the story was far from over. A single moment, a slip, a splash loomed just ahead, ready to transform their labor into a testament of God's care. For now they walked on, their eyes on the river, their hearts open to whatever lay beyond the next swing of the axe. The Jordan River sparkled under the midday sun, its banks alive with the rhythm of labor. The sons of the prophets, their hearts buoyed by purpose, swung their axes with steady precision, each strike sending chips of wood flying. The trees along the river yielded to their efforts, their branches heavy with the promise of a new home. Laughter and the thud of iron against timber filled the air, a symphony of progress under Elisha's watchful eye. The group moved as one, their unity a testament to the vision that had brought them here. But in a single fleeting moment, that harmony shattered, and a simple task became a crisis that would etch itself into their story. One of the young prophets, his muscles taut from hours of work, raised his axe for another swing. The blade bit deep into the tree, but as he pulled back, the iron head slipped from its handle, tearing free with a sickening lurch. Time seemed to slow as the axe head arced through the air, glinting in the sunlight before plunging into the Jordan's murky waters. A splash broke the silence, ripples spreading across the surface as the tool vanished into the depths. The young man froze, his hands gripping the now useless handle, his face a mask of disbelief. The others turned, their axes falling still, as the weight of what had just happened settled over them. This was no small loss. The axe head was borrowed, a precious tool in a time when iron was rare and costly. To lose it was to break a trust, to incur a debt that could haunt a man for years. In ancient Israel, borrowing carried a sacred weight. Returning what was lent was a matter of honor, of survival. The young prophet's heart pounded as he stared at the water, its surface now calm, mocking his panic. He could almost see the axe head sinking deeper, swallowed by the river's unrelenting current. His mind raced with the consequences, the shame of facing the tool's owner, the burden of repayment, the disruption to their work. What had been a moment of strength now felt like failure. "Master!" he cried, turning to Elisha, his voice raw with desperation. The other prophets gathered closer, their eyes darting between their friend and the river. "It was borrowed," he stammered, the words spilling out like a confession. "I've lost it, the axe head, it's gone." His hands gestured wildly toward the water, as if he could will the tool back to the surface. The weight of his responsibility pressed down, each ripple in the Jordan a reminder of what was now out of reach. The group's earlier joy gave way to a tense silence, their shared purpose tested by this sudden setback. Elisha, standing a few paces away, met the young man's frantic gaze with a calm that seemed to still the very air. While the prophet's distress was palpable, Elisha's composure was unshaken, his eyes reflecting a quiet confidence that spoke of deeper truths. He stepped forward, his robe brushing the earth, and asked simply, "Where did it fall?" The question was gentle yet deliberate, cutting through the young man's panic like a blade through fog. The prophet pointed to the spot where the water had claimed his tool, his hand trembling. Elisha's steadiness was a lifeline, a reminder that all was not lost, not yet. The river, for all its beauty, was no forgiving friend. Its currents ran swift and deep, its depths clouded with silt that hid whatever it took. The axe head might as well have been swallowed by the earth itself, so impossible seemed its recovery. The sons of the prophets knew this, their faces etched with concern as they watched Elisha. They had seen him work wonders before, but this, an iron tool lost to the river's grasp? It was a problem too small for grand miracles, yet too big for human hands to solve. The tension hung heavy, a moment where faith and despair stood face to face. This loss, though, was more than a missing tool, it was a mirror to the human heart. Who among us hasn't felt the sting of something slipping away? A job, a relationship, a dream gone in an instant, leaving us grasping at empty air. The young prophet's cry echoes our own when life's currents pull what we cherish out of reach. His panic speaks to those moments when we realize our own strength isn't enough, when the weight of responsibility threatens to drown us. Yet in his turning to Elisha, we see a flicker of hope, a choice to seek help, to lean on one who walks with God. His story reminds us that setbacks, however small or searing, are never the end in God's hands. Elisha's calm response was the first step towards something greater. While the young prophet saw only loss, Elisha saw possibility. His question, "Where did it fall?" wasn't just practical. It was an invitation to trust, to pinpoint the place of need and lay it before God. The sons of the prophets, watching in silence, sensed that this moment was shifting, that the river's theft might not have the final word. The young man's distress, raw and real, was about to meet a power that could turn despair into wonder. The Jordan, with its history of miracles, was once again a stage for God's work, and Elisha stood ready to show the way. The crisis of the lost axe head was a small thing in the grand sweep of Israel's story, yet it carried a weight that resonates across time. It speaks to the God who sees our smallest struggles, who hears the cries we think too trivial to voice. The young prophet's panic was not dismissed. It was met with a prophet's care, a prelude to a miracle that would restore more than a tool, it would restore faith. As Elisha prepared to act, the group held its breath. The river's surface still, as if waiting for what would come next. The impossible loomed before them, but so did the promise of God's power, ready to break through in a way none could have foreseen. The story was turning, the tension building toward a moment that would redefine this day by the Jordan. The young prophet's loss had set the stage. His cry had called forth Elisha's response, and now the river itself seemed to pause, its waters holding a secret soon to be revealed. The sons of the prophets stood on the edge of a miracle, their faith stretched but not broken. What had been lost was not gone forever, not when God's prophet was near, not when his power was at work. The axe head's plunge into the Jordan was only the beginning, a spark that would ignite a story of restoration and awe. The Jordan River stood silent, its surface a deceptive calm that hid the crisis unfolding on its banks. The young prophet, his heart still racing from the loss of the borrowed axe head, stood frozen, his eyes locked on the water that had swallowed his hope. The sons of the prophets around him shared his unease, their axes idle, their shared purpose shaken by the sudden weight of the setback. The river's depths seemed to mock their efforts, the precious iron tool now beyond reach, a debt and a shame sinking deeper with every passing moment. Yet in the midst of this tension, one figure remained unshaken: Elisha, the prophet of God, whose quiet presence held a promise that the story was far from over. The young man's cries still echoed in the air, his desperate words, "It was borrowed," hanging like a plea. He turned to Elisha, his teacher, his guide, the one who had walked with them from their cramped home to this riverside labor. His eyes, wide with panic, met Elisha's steady gaze, and in that moment, the prophet's calm became a lifeline. Elisha stepped closer, his robe catching the breeze, his voice cutting through the young man's fear with a single, simple question: "Where did it fall?" The words were gentle but deliberate, a call to focus, to name the place of loss and lay it bare. The young prophet, his hand trembling, pointed to the spot where the axe head had vanished, the water's surface now still, as if nothing had happened. Elisha's question was more than practical. It was a bridge between despair and hope. It invited the young man to pause, to trust, to believe that even this impossible loss was not beyond God's reach. The sons of the prophets watched, their breath held, as Elisha moved toward the river's edge. His movements were unhurried, each step imbued with a purpose that seemed to draw the group into a deeper expectancy. He bent down, his eyes scanning the bank, and selected a stick from the scattered branches at his feet. The wood was ordinary, weathered by sun and wind. Yet in Elisha's hands, it became something more: a tool, a symbol, a vessel for what was to come. The young prophet and his companions stood transfixed as Elisha took the stick and began to trim it with his knife. His hands moved with care, stripping away excess, shaping the wood with a precision that spoke of intention. The sound of the blade against the stick was soft but steady, a rhythm that seemed to hush the group's lingering anxiety. What was he doing? The question hung unspoken among them, their eyes following every motion. The stick, so simple, so unremarkable, carried a weight in Elisha's grasp that none could fully grasp. Was it a sign of faith, a marker of God's authority, or something else entirely? The river itself seemed to wait, its current slowing as if sensing the moment's gravity. In ancient Israel, prophets were more than teachers, they were mediators, men who stood between God and his people, carrying divine power into human struggles. Elisha, heir to Elijah's mantle, embodied this role. His life was a testament to God's nearness, his actions a conduit for miracles that defied reason. The sons of the prophets knew this, their memories alive with stories of his wonders: water purified, oil multiplied, a child restored to life. Now, as he held the stick, they sensed that same power stirring, ready to meet their small but searing need. Elisha's confidence was not his own. It was rooted in the God who had called him, the God who saw every loss and heard every cry. The stick in Elisha's hands became a focal point, a tangible link to the miracle about to unfold. Some among the group might have seen it as a symbol of faith, ordinary, like their own trust, yet capable of extraordinary things when placed in God's hands. Others might have sensed in it a shadow of divine authority, a reminder that God's power could work through the humblest means. The stick was not the miracle, but it was the prophet's act of obedience, his willingness to act in faith before the impossible. For the young prophet, still reeling from his loss, Elisha's deliberate preparation was a beacon, pulling him from the edge of despair toward the hope of restoration. The tension on the riverbank grew, a quiet suspense that wrapped the group in its embrace. The Jordan's waters, deep and unyielding, held the axe head captive, its iron weight no match for human hands. Yet Elisha's calm, his careful shaping of the stick, spoke of a power greater than the river's grasp. The sons of the prophets leaned closer, their earlier panic giving way to anticipation. They had seen Elisha's miracles before, but this moment felt different, personal, immediate, a response to a cry that could have been their own. The young man who had lost the axe head stood nearest, his eyes fixed on Elisha, his heart caught between doubt and daring to believe. This scene, so vivid in its simplicity, speaks to the heart of dependence on God. The young prophet's turn to Elisha mirrors our own moments of need, when we reach for help beyond ourselves. His cry was not met with judgment or dismissal, but with a question that invited trust. Elisha's role as mediator reminds us that God places guides in our lives, voices of wisdom, hands of help who point us to his power. The stick, ordinary yet chosen, whispers that God can use the simplest things to work his wonders, if only we surrender our struggles to him. The story pauses here, on the edge of the impossible, with Elisha's hands holding the promise of what's to come. The Jordan waited, its surface reflecting the faces of those who stood on its banks. Elisha, stick in hand, was ready to act, his faith a bridge between the young man's loss and God's provision. The sons of the prophets, their eyes wide with wonder, felt the weight of the moment, a moment where human effort ended and divine power began. The axe head, lost to the river's depths, was about to meet a force that could defy nature itself. The story was turning, the miracle drawing near, and the group stood poised to witness a truth that would echo far beyond the Jordan. That God hears, God sees, and God moves, even in the smallest of our needs. The Jordan River held its breath, its waters still as the sons of the prophets stood on its banks, their eyes fixed on Elisha. The young prophet's loss, a borrowed axe head, swallowed by the river's depths, had brought them to this moment, a moment thick with anticipation. Elisha, the stick he had carefully shaped still in his hands, stood at the water's edge, his calm presence a stark contrast to the tension that gripped the group. The ordinary piece of wood, stripped and ready, was no longer just a stick. It was a vessel of faith, poised to carry God's power into the impossible. The air was heavy with expectancy, every heart waiting for what the prophet would do next. Elisha raised the stick, his movements steady and sure, and with a single deliberate motion, he cast it into the Jordan. The wood hit the water with a soft splash, sending ripples spreading outward in perfect circles. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. The river seemed to pause, its surface gleaming under the sun, as if testing the weight of the moment. Then from the murky depths, something stirred. A glint of iron broke through, rising slowly, impossibly, until the axe head itself floated on the water's surface, its surface catching the sunlight like a polished jewel. It bobbed gently, defying every law of nature, a heavy iron tool held aloft by a power beyond reason. A gasp rippled through the sons of the prophets, their voices rising in a chorus of awe. "It's floating," one cried, his words half laughter, half disbelief. "The axe head, it's there," another stammered, pointing as if to convince himself it was real. Their eyes, wide with wonder, darted between the river and Elisha, who stood quietly, his face serene, untouched by pride. The young prophet who had lost the tool stood closest to the water, his hands trembling, his earlier panic replaced by a joy that bordered on worship. "Master," he whispered, his voice breaking, "how can this be?" Elisha only nodded, his humility a silent testimony to the God who had moved through him. The miracle was breathtaking in its simplicity. No thunder shook the heavens, no fire fell from the sky, just a stick, a splash, and an iron axe head that refused to sink. Yet in that quiet act, God's sovereignty shone brighter than the sun on the Jordan. The laws of nature, which bound iron to sink and water to swallow, bowed before the one who had shaped them. This was no mere trick. It was a declaration that God holds dominion over creation, that his power knows no limits, not even in the smallest of needs. The axe head's rise was a miracle as profound as any in Israel's history, a moment where the ordinary became extraordinary through God's hand. The sons of the prophets, still reeling, began to speak among themselves, their words tumbling over one another. "It's like the waters parting for Joshua," one said, his voice hushed with reverence. "Or when Elijah crossed this very river on dry ground," another added, his eyes still on the floating iron. The miracle stirred memories of God's mighty acts, each one a thread in the tapestry of Israel's faith. The narrator's voice, steady and reflective, drew a deeper connection. This moment echoed the wonders of Jesus, who would one day walk on water, calming storms and bending creation to his will. Just as Jesus showed mastery over the sea, Elisha's act revealed God's power to restore what seemed lost forever, to bring hope where despair had taken root. The significance of the miracle lay not just in its defiance of nature, but in its intimacy. The axe head was no sacred relic, no king's treasure. It was a borrowed tool, a small thing that carried great weight for one man's honor and duty. Yet God saw fit to intervene, to reach into the Jordan's depths for something others might dismiss. This was a God who cared for the details, who heard the cry of a single heart and answered with a wonder that left a whole community in awe. The floating axe head became a symbol of restoration, a promise that what slips away, be it a tool, a dream, or a piece of ourselves, can be brought back by the one who holds all things. Elisha's humility in the face of such power was as striking as the miracle itself. While the sons of the prophets marveled, he remained silent, his gaze on the river, his heart attuned to the God he served. He sought no glory, no acclaim, only to point others to the source of this wonder. His role as prophet was not to dazzle, but to direct, to show the sons of the prophets that their faith in God was well placed. The young prophet, still staring at the axe head, felt this truth settle deep within him. His loss had become a lesson, his cry a catalyst for a miracle that would strengthen them all. The scene was one of pure wonder, the Jordan's banks alive with the energy of what had just happened. The axe head, gleaming on the water, was a beacon of God's care, a tangible proof that he moves in ways we cannot predict. The sons of the prophets, their voices now a blend of laughter and praise, felt their faith expand, their trust in God deepened by what they had witnessed. The river, once a place of loss, had become a stage for redemption, its waters bearing witness to a power that could make iron float and hearts soar. This miracle invites us to pause and reflect. How often do we face losses that seem final, setbacks that feel like endings? The floating axe head whispers that nothing is too small for God's attention, no loss too deep for his reach. Like the sons of the prophets, we are called to stand in awe, to see our struggles not as endpoints, but as opportunities for God to work. The miracle on the Jordan reminds us that restoration is His promise, that what sinks into the depths can rise again when He speaks. The axe head floated not because of the stick, but because of the God who used it, the same God who meets us in our need with a power that defies all we know. The moment hung in the air, the axe head still bobbing on the water, the sons of the prophets still caught in wonder. Elisha's work was not yet done, but the miracle had unfolded, its impact rippling through the group like the waves on the Jordan. The story was moving forward, the promise of restoration now within reach. The young prophet, his heart full, stood ready to reclaim what was lost, while the others looked to Elisha, knowing they had witnessed something sacred. The river, the stick, the iron all had played their part in a moment that would echo through their lives, a testament to a God who makes the impossible possible. The Jordan River shimmered under the afternoon sun, its waters cradling an impossible sight. A heavy iron axe head, floating as if weightless, gleaming like a gift from the heavens. The sons of the prophets stood frozen on the bank, their gasps of awe still lingering in the air, their eyes wide with the wonder of what God had done through Elisha. The young prophet who had lost the tool, his heart once heavy with panic, now trembled with a different emotion, hope raw and radiant, as he stared at the miracle before him. The river, which had stolen his honor and his peace, had become a stage for restoration, and the story was ready to turn toward joy. Elisha, his face calm and unassuming, nodded toward the water. "Take it," he said, his voice gentle but firm, as if the miracle were the most natural thing in the world. The young prophet hesitated, almost afraid to break the spell of the moment, then stepped forward, his sandals sinking into the soft earth of the riverbank. He reached out, his fingers brushing the water's surface, and grasped the axe head. It was solid, cold, real, its weight in his hand, a stark contrast to its impossible buoyancy moments before. He lifted it high, water dripping from its edge, and a smile broke across his face, wide and unguarded. "It's back," he whispered, half to himself, half to the God who had made it so. "It's really back." The sons of the prophets erupted in cheers, their voices a joyful chorus that echoed across the Jordan. "Praise God," one shouted, his hands raised to the sky. "Blessed be the Lord who hears us," another called, his eyes shining with tears. They crowded around the young prophet, clapping his shoulders, their laughter mingling with words of gratitude. "Elisha, you've done it again," one said, turning to their teacher with reverence. But Elisha shook his head, his humility unwavering. "Not I," he said softly, "but the God who sees every need." The young prophet clutched the axe head to his chest, his voice breaking as he spoke. "Thank you, Master. Thank you, Lord. I thought it was gone forever." This moment of recovery was more than the return of a tool, it was the restoration of trust, of honor, of faith. The axe head, borrowed and precious, had carried the weight of the young prophet's responsibility. Its loss had threatened shame and debt, a burden that could have lingered for years. Now, in his hands, it was a symbol of God's care, a tangible reminder that no need is too small for the one who holds creation in his hands. The river, once a thief, had become a partner in this miracle, its waters yielding what it had taken because God had spoken through Elisha's act. The young prophet's joy was not just for himself, but for the community that shared his relief, their unity strengthened by this shared wonder. The narrator's voice, warm and reflective, wove the moment into a larger truth. This restoration was a testament to God's provision, a promise that He sees the details of our lives, the borrowed tools, the quiet fears, the losses we think too trivial to name. The axe head's return was a whisper of God's heart, a sign that He delights in making whole what is broken, in lifting what has fallen. For the sons of the prophets, this miracle was personal, a direct answer to a cry that could have been overlooked. It invited them and us to trust God not only in the grand moments, but in the small, everyday struggles that shape our days. The scene shifted as the group's joy gave way to action. The sons of the prophets, their faith renewed, returned to their work with a vigor that hadn't been there before. Axes swung once more, the thud of iron against wood a rhythm of gratitude. The trees along the Jordan fell steadily, their branches piling high as the vision of a new home took shape. The young prophet, his axe head now securely fastened, worked alongside his brothers, his swing stronger, his heart lighter. Every stroke was a prayer, every felled tree a testament to the God who had restored what was lost. The river, no longer a place of fear, sparkled beside them, its waters a quiet witness to the miracle that had changed everything. The impact of this moment rippled through the community. The sons of the prophets were not just building a physical space, they were building a legacy of faith. The miracle had deepened their trust in God, their reliance on Elisha, their bond with one another. They spoke of it as they worked, their voices carrying the story forward. "Did you see it?" one would ask, grinning. "Iron doesn't float, but God made it so." Another would nod, adding, "He cared enough to bring it back for one of us." The miracle was a shared treasure, a story they would tell long after the new home was built, a reminder that God's power was as near as their prayers. This gratitude was the heartbeat of the moment. The sons of the prophets didn't take the miracle for granted. They let it fuel their worship, their work, their hope. The young prophet, now free from the shadow of debt, carried a new confidence not in himself, but in the God who had heard his cry. His gratitude was matched by his brothers, who saw in the floating axe head a truth they could hold on to, that God's provision is sure, his care unwavering. The miracle had not only restored a tool, it had restored their perspective, reminding them that every challenge, big or small, could be met with trust in him. The Jordan's banks, alive with the sounds of labor and laughter, bore witness to a community transformed. The sons of the prophets worked as one, their axes flashing in the sunlight, their hearts full of praise. Elisha watched quietly, his role as mediator complete, his faith in God's goodness unshaken. The miracle had done its work, not just in the water, but in the souls of those who witnessed it. The axe head, now back in use, was more than a tool, it was a symbol of God's nearness, a spark that would kindle their faith for years to come. The story of the floating axe head was now a story of recovery, of gratitude, of a community drawn closer to God. The sons of the prophets, their work resuming, carried this truth in their hearts, that God sees, God hears, and God provides. The river, the axe, the miracle, all had played their part in revealing a God who delights in restoration. As the trees continued to fall and the vision of a new home grew clearer, the group moved forward, their faith stronger, their gratitude deeper, ready for whatever lay ahead in the hands of the God who made iron float. The Jordan River's banks fade from view, the echo of the sons of the prophets' gratitude lingering like a gentle breeze. The miracle of the floating axe head, so vivid and transformative, has left its mark not just on those who witnessed it, but on us, centuries later, as we ponder its meaning. Now we step away from the ancient riverside to sit with a voice of wisdom, a modern-day pastor whose heart is stirred by this story. His words, warm and grounded, invite us to unpack the theological treasures hidden in this simple yet profound moment, to see how God's power, care, and call to faith speak to our lives today. Pastor Daniel, a man whose kind eyes and thoughtful demeanor draw us in, leans forward in a cozy study, a Bible open before him. The story of the floating axe head, he begins, is more than a miracle, it's a window into who God is. At its heart, it reveals a God who wields unmatched power, not for show, but for love. Think about it. An iron tool, lost in a river's depths, defies every rule of nature to float at his command. This isn't just about bending physics. It's about a creator who holds every detail of his creation in his hands, ready to move when his people cry out. His voice carries a quiet conviction, as if the Jordan's waters still ripple in his imagination. The pastor pauses, his gaze steady. What strikes me most is God's care for the individual. The axe head wasn't a kingdom's treasure or a prophet's sacred staff. It was a borrowed tool, vital to one young man's honor and livelihood. Its loss could have been dismissed as trivial, but God didn't see it that way. He heard the young prophet's distress, saw his need, and acted through Elisha to restore what was lost. This tells us something profound. No need is too small for God's attention. Whether it's a tool sunk in a river or a burden weighing on your heart, He cares enough to intervene, to make whole what's broken. Pastor Daniel's words turn to the role of faith in crises. The young prophet didn't solve his problem alone. He turned to Elisha, trusting in God's power through his prophet. That act of dependence, that cry for help, was faith in action. It reminds us that faith isn't about having all the answers. It's about knowing where to turn when the waters of life overwhelm us. The miracle happened because the young man trusted enough to ask, because Elisha trusted enough to act. Faith in this story is the bridge between loss and restoration, the spark that invites God's power into our struggles. To bring this ancient truth closer, the pastor shares a story from today's world. Picture Sarah, a single mother who lost her job unexpectedly, her confidence shaken as bills piled up. Like the young prophet, she felt the sting of loss, the fear of an uncertain future. But in her crisis, she turned to her church, praying with friends who lifted her burden before God. Weeks later, a new job came, not just any job, but one that restored her stability and hope. Sarah's story, Pastor Daniel says, echoes the axe head's rise. It's not always a dramatic miracle, but it's God's provision, His way of saying, I see you and I'm here. Another example unfolds. A man named James, estranged from his daughter for years, his heart heavy with regret. The rift seemed permanent, like iron sunk in a river's depths. Yet through prayer and a willingness to seek forgiveness, James reached out, and slowly their relationship began to heal. A phone call, a tearful conversation, a shared meal. These were the ripples of restoration, God's quiet work in mending what was broken. These stories, the pastor reflects, show us that the God of the Jordan is still at work, bringing back what we thought was lost, whether it's a job, a relationship, or even our sense of purpose. The narrator's voice, steady and reflective, ties these insights to Elisha's broader ministry. Elisha was no stranger to God's faithfulness, having seen it in miracles great and small, from purifying poisoned waters to raising a child from death. The floating axe head, though humble, fits this pattern of God's consistent care. It reminds us that Elisha's role was to point people to a God who never fails, who meets His people in their need with power and compassion. The sons of the prophets learned this by the Jordan, their faith deepened by a miracle that spoke to their everyday lives. Pastor Daniel leans closer, his voice earnest. This story challenges us to look at our own lives. What have you lost that feels beyond recovery? A dream, a connection, a piece of yourself? The floating axe head tells us to bring those losses to God, to trust that He can restore what seems impossible. It's not about deserving a miracle. It's about believing in a God who delights in provision. And when He moves, whether through a dramatic sign or a quiet answer, our response should be gratitude, a heart that praises Him for His faithfulness. The pastor's words resonate with a deeper truth. The miracle's relevance isn't bound by time. The God who made iron float for a young prophet is the same God who walks with us through modern crises. Whether it's a financial struggle, a fractured relationship, or a season of doubt, the story invites us to see our challenges through the lens of faith. The axe head's rise is a call to trust, to depend on God's power, and to rest in His care. It's a reminder that restoration is His specialty, that what sinks into the depths of our lives can surface again by His hand. As Pastor Daniel closes, he offers a final reflection. The sons of the prophets didn't just get their axe head back, they got a glimpse of God's heart. They saw His power, His care, his willingness to act for one person's need. That's the God we serve, the God who invites us to bring every loss, every crisis to him. He's still in the business of making iron float, of turning despair into hope. His words linger, a gentle challenge to carry this truth into our own stories, to trust that God's faithfulness is as real today as it was by the Jordan. The narrator's voice returns, weaving the reflection into the broader tapestry of the story. The miracle of the floating axe head, though rooted in an ancient riverbank, speaks to every heart that longs for restoration. It deepens our understanding of a God who sees, who hears, who moves. As we leave Pastor Daniel's study, we carry his insights with us, ready to see the story's next chapter through eyes of faith. The sons of the prophets, their community strengthened, stand as a testament to God's unchanging nature, and we, like them, are invited to trust him with our own rivers, our own losses, our own hopes for what he will do next. The miracle of the floating axe head still lingers in our minds, a moment where God's power transformed a simple loss into a testament of his care. As we step back from the Jordan's banks, we turn our gaze to the world that shaped this story, to the ancient Israel of Elisha's day. To understand the weight of this miracle, we must walk the dusty paths of that time, feel the rhythm of its daily life, and see the people who lived it. This was a world of hard-won harvests, sacred callings, and communal bonds, where an iron tool and a prophet's guidance carried meanings deeper than we might first imagine. Let's journey into the historical and cultural context of this story, where ordinary circumstances became the canvas for God's extraordinary work. Ancient Israel in the days of Elisha was a land of contrasts. The kingdom stood divided: Israel in the north, Judah in the south, its people caught between devotion to God and the pull of idolatry. Cities like Samaria bustled with trade, while rural villages thrived on the labor of farmers and craftsmen. Life was tied to the land, to the cycles of planting and reaping, to the tools that made survival possible. Homes were modest, often built of mud brick or stone, their roofs shaded by olive trees or date palms. Markets hummed with the clink of silver and the barter of goods: grain, oil, woven cloth. Yet this was no idyllic paradise. It was a world where every resource was precious, where a single tool could mean the difference between abundance and want. In this society, iron tools like the axe head were treasures. Iron was rare, its forging a skill mastered by few. Picture a blacksmith at work, his forge glowing red as he hammers molten metal into shape. Sweat beads on his brow, the clang of his hammer a steady rhythm. The process was slow, costly, requiring charcoal, skill, and patience. An axe head, once crafted, was not just a tool but an investment, often shared among neighbors or lent with the expectation of careful use. To borrow such a tool was to accept a sacred trust, a commitment to return it intact. When the young prophet lost the axe head to the Jordan, he wasn't just losing a piece of metal, he was risking his reputation, his ability to repay a debt that could burden him for years. The communal ethos of ancient Israel made this loss even more significant. People lived in tight-knit communities, their survival woven together by mutual support. Families shared wells, fields, and tools, their lives bound by a code of honor that valued trust above all. Borrowing was common, but it came with responsibility. If a tool was lost or broken, the borrower was expected to replace it, a task that could plunge a poor man into hardship. The young prophet's cry, "It was borrowed," carried the weight of this culture, his distress rooted in the knowledge that his loss affected not just him, but the one who had trusted him with the axe. The miracle, then, was not just about restoring a tool, but about preserving the bonds of community, about God stepping into the fabric of their shared life. Elisha's role in this story shines brighter when we understand the place of prophets in Israel. Prophets were God's messengers, his voice in a world prone to forget him. They were not solitary mystics, but leaders, teachers, and mediators, often living among the people they served. Elisha, successor to the fiery Elijah, was a towering figure in this tradition. He was known for miracles purifying springs, multiplying food, but also for his presence among ordinary people, guiding them through crises both spiritual and practical. His life was a bridge between heaven and earth, his actions a reflection of God's heart for his covenant people. The sons of the prophets who followed Elisha were more than disciples, they were a school, a training ground for spiritual leaders. Picture them gathered in their cramped quarters, studying Torah, praying, and learning to discern God's voice. They were young men called to serve, to carry God's word to a nation in need. Their community was a microcosm of Israel's faith, a place where obedience and trust were forged. Elisha was their mentor, their model of what it meant to walk with God. When they proposed building a new home, they weren't just seeking space, they were preparing to expand their ministry, to train more voices to speak for God. The miracle of the axe head, happening in the midst of their labor, was a divine affirmation of their calling, a sign that God was with them in their work. The Jordan River itself, where the miracle unfolded, held deep significance in Israelite culture. It was more than a waterway, it was a symbol of God's power and presence. Generations before, Joshua led Israel across its parted waters into the Promised Land, a miracle etched in their memory. Elijah, Elisha's mentor, had crossed the Jordan on dry ground before ascending to heaven, passing his mantle to Elisha. The river was a place of transition, of divine encounter, its currents carrying the weight of Israel's story. When the axe head sank into its depths, it was as if the river challenged the sons of the prophets to trust God anew. When it floated, it was as if the Jordan itself bore witness to God's faithfulness, adding another chapter to its sacred history. This context, the value of iron, the ethos of community, the role of prophets, the weight of the Jordan enriches the miracle's meaning. It shows us a God who works through the ordinary, who uses the tools and trials of daily life to reveal his power. The floating axe head was not a spectacle for its own sake. It was a miracle woven into the fabric of Israelite society, addressing a real need in a way that strengthened faith and community. The young prophet's restored axe head was a restored trust, a preserved honor, a renewed call to serve. The sons of the prophets, witnessing this, saw not just a floating tool, but a God who cared for their work, their lives, their future. The authenticity of this story lies in its grounding in history. The Israel of Elisha's day, with its blacksmiths, borrowers, and prophetic schools, was real, its challenges and hopes as vivid as our own. The miracle's power comes not from exaggeration, but from its simplicity, a lost tool, a desperate cry, a stick thrown into water. God met his people where they were, in the midst of their labor, their community, their faith. This historical rooting makes the story resonate across time, inviting us to see our own world through its lens. Our tools may be different, our communities shaped by new rhythms, but the God who made iron float is the same, his care as near now as it was then. As we linger in this ancient world, we see the sons of the prophets more clearly, their calloused hands, their shared dreams, their trust in Elisha. We feel the weight of the axe head, the trust it represented, the relief of its return. We hear the Jordan's quiet rush, a reminder of God's presence in the ordinary. This context doesn't just explain the story, it brings it to life, showing us how God's miracles are not distant wonders, but acts of love woven into the fabric of his people's lives. The floating axe head, set against this backdrop, becomes a beacon of hope, a truth that carries us forward. That God sees, God acts, and God restores, even in the smallest corners of our world. The ancient banks of the Jordan River fade, replaced by the soft glow of a modern living room, where a small group gathers around a coffee table strewn with mugs and open Bibles. The miracle of the floating axe head, though centuries old, feels as near as the conversation unfolding here. The sons of the prophets, their joy at the restored tool, and Elisha's quiet faith have left us with a story that transcends time, its truths ready to meet us in our own lives. Today we sit with a diverse circle of believers, men and women, young and old, each with their own struggles and hopes to explore how this ancient miracle speaks to our faith now, how a floating axe head can become a beacon for trusting God in the impossible. The narrator's voice, warm and inviting, sets the scene. The story of the floating axe head isn't just a tale from ancient Israel, it's a mirror for our own journeys. It asks us to consider, what do we do when we face losses that seem beyond repair? How do we trust God when the waters of life feel too deep? In the room, Maria, a young teacher with a gentle smile, leans forward. For me, she says, this story hits close to home. Last year, I lost my sense of direction. I was teaching, raising 2 kids, but I felt stuck, like I'd lost something I couldn't name. It was like that axe head sunk, out of reach. Maria's voice softens as she continues. I started praying, not for a big miracle, but for guidance. I joined a small group at church, and through their support, I found clarity. A new opportunity opened a role at a school where I could really make a difference. It wasn't dramatic, but it was God, pulling what I'd lost back to the surface. Her story echoes the young prophet's, her axe head not iron, but purpose, restored through trust and community. The group nods, their faces reflecting her relief, her gratitude. The axe head becomes a metaphor here, a symbol of anything we've lost: hope, opportunity, peace that God can bring back when we turn to Him. Next, David, a middle-aged mechanic with calloused hands, shares his experience. I've had my share of impossible situations, he says, his voice steady but tinged with emotion. A few years back, my shop was failing. Bills were piling up, and I couldn't see a way out. I felt like that young prophet panicking by the river. But I remembered a verse about God providing, and I prayed hard. I didn't get a miracle overnight, but a friend connected me with a new client, and bit by bit, the business turned around. It was like God lifted my axe head, not with a stick, but with people, with small steps I could take. David's story grounds the miracle in the grit of everyday life, showing that God's intervention often comes through persistence and faith. The narrator weaves these stories together, drawing out their common thread. Maria and David, like the young prophet, faced moments where loss felt final, but they trusted God, sought His guidance, and saw Him work. The floating axe head teaches us that recovery begins with faith to cry out, to wait, to act when God points the way. It's a reminder that no situation is too hopeless for Him, no loss too deep for His reach. The room hums with agreement as Elisha, a college student, adds her voice. I love how the story shows God caring about something small, like a tool. It makes me think He cares about my anxieties too, like exams or figuring out my future. Praying helps me trust He's got it, even when I can't see how. The discussion turns to the act of seeking God's guidance, a practical step the story models. The young prophet didn't try to dive into the Jordan himself. He turned to Elisha, who pointed him to God. That's our call, the narrator says, to pray, to seek wise counsel, to lay our impossible situations before God. The axe head floated because one man trusted enough to ask for help, and Elisha trusted enough to act. We can do the same, bringing our losses to God, believing He can restore what's gone. The group's stories reflect this, each one a testament to prayer and community as pathways to God's provision. To make the story accessible, the narrator offers reflection questions, their words a gentle invitation. What's your axe head? What have you lost that feels out of reach? Maybe it's a relationship strained by time, a dream buried under doubt, or a confidence you can't seem to regain. Take a moment to name it, to bring it to God in prayer. Ask yourself, who can I turn to for guidance, like the young prophet turned to Elisha? And how can I trust God's timing, even when the waters seem too deep? These questions linger, giving listeners space to connect the story to their own lives, to see their struggles through the lens of faith. The group's diversity, different ages, backgrounds, experiences mirrors the universal reach of the story's lessons. An older woman, Grace, shares a quieter story. "I lost my husband 2 years ago," she says, her voice steady but soft. "The grief was heavy, like that axe head sinking. But through prayer and my faith community, I found hope again. It's not about getting him back, but about God restoring my joy, my ability to live fully. That's my miracle." Grace's words deepen the metaphor, showing that recovery isn't always about reclaiming what was lost, but about receiving what God provides: peace, strength, a new beginning. The narrator ties these stories to the story's core truth. The floating axe head is a promise of hope, a sign that God sees our needs, big and small. It invites us to trust Him in impossible situations, to believe that what's sunk can surface again. Maria found purpose, David found provision, Elisha found peace, Grace found joy, all because they leaned on God, just as the young prophet leaned on Elisha. Their faith didn't erase the struggle, but it opened the door to God's work. The room feels alive with this truth, the group's shared stories a modern echo of the Jordan's miracle. As the conversation closes, the narrator's voice grows reflective. This story challenges us to apply its lessons every day. When life feels overwhelming, when losses pile up, we can follow the young prophet's example. Cry out to God, seek His guidance, trust His power. The axe head floated not because of human effort, but because God moved. He's still moving today, ready to meet us in our rivers, ready to restore what we've lost. The sons of the prophets carried this miracle in their hearts, and we can carry it too, a spark of hope that lights the way through any darkness. The living room, with its warm light and shared stories, becomes a bridge between ancient Israel and our world. The floating axe head, once a moment by the Jordan, is now a call to action, to pray, to trust, to hope. The group's faith, their willingness to share, invites us to do the same, to see our own impossible situations as opportunities for God to work. The story of the axe head, simple yet profound, lives on. Its lessons a guide for modern faith, its promise a reminder that with God, no loss is final, no river too deep for His love to reach. The Jordan River's shimmering waters fade from our sight, but the miracle of the floating axe head burns bright, its truth etched in our hearts. We've journeyed with the sons of the prophets, felt the sting of a borrowed tool lost to the river, and marveled as God's power brought it back, gleaming under the sun. This story from ancient Israel isn't just a moment frozen in time. It's a living call to faith, a testament to miracles, and a promise of God's provision that speaks to us now. As we close this chapter, let's hold its lessons close, letting them guide us through our own challenges and inspire us to trust the God who makes the impossible possible. Picture that riverside scene one last time. A young prophet, his hope sinking with the axe head, his desperate cry met by Elisha's steady faith. A stick tossed into the water, a ripple, and then against all reason an iron tool floating on the Jordan surface. The sons of the prophets' shouts of joy, their gratitude, their renewed purpose, these moments weave a story that resonates across generations. It's a story of faith, of daring to trust God when loss feels final. It's a story of miracles where God reshapes creation to show His love. And it's a story of provision, of a God who sees our smallest needs, a tool, a heart, a future, and answers with care that transforms. This miracle carries a challenge for us today. The young prophet didn't face his crisis alone. He turned to Elisha, who led him to God's power. That's our invitation, to trust God with our own sunken axe heads, our doubts, our setbacks, our broken dreams. Whether it's a job lost like Sarah's, a relationship fractured like James's, or a purpose dimmed like Maria's, the God who lifted iron from the Jordan is the same God who meets us in our need. He calls us to pray, to seek His guidance, to believe that no loss is too deep for His hand to restore. The sons of the prophets found this truth by the river, and their story beckons us to step forward in faith, trusting God's provision in every season. This story isn't ours to keep, it's ours to share. Imagine telling a friend about the floating axe head, about a God who cares enough to recover a borrowed tool. Picture inviting someone to explore this miracle with you, to see how it speaks to their own struggles. The sons of the prophets didn't hide their joy, they worked with new strength, their faith a light for all to see. We can do the same, letting this story's hope ripple outward. Share it over a meal, post it online, or bring it to a conversation. Your voice can carry this miracle, inviting others to discover a God who restores what seems lost forever. Let's pause now for a prayer, lifting our hearts to the God who made this story real. Heavenly Father, we thank you for your power, your love, your faithfulness that never fails. Thank you for the miracle of the floating axe head, for showing us that no need is beyond your care. Help us trust you with our challenges, seek your wisdom, and share your hope with those around us. Give us faith to face our rivers, knowing you are near, ready to restore what we've lost. May our lives shine with your love, just as the Jordan shone with your power. In Jesus' name, amen. This story and the God at its heart calls us to go deeper. Subscribe to the Biblical Journey YouTube channel to explore more stories from Scripture, each one a window into God's truth. Dive into videos that bring the Bible to life, offering insights and inspiration to grow your faith. Join our community, share your thoughts in the comments, and let the floating axe head be a spark for your spiritual journey. The sons of the prophets built a new home with the timber they gathered. You can build a stronger faith with the stories you discover here. Hit that subscribe button, turn on notifications, and let's keep exploring God's Word together. As we leave the Jordan behind, we carry its miracle with us, a promise that God sees, hears, and acts. The young prophet's relief, Elisha's quiet faith, the sons of the prophets' praise, these are gifts to hold close. Trust God with your challenges, share His hope with others, and let His provision shape your path. The credits may roll, but the story lives on in every prayer you whisper, every step you take in faith. And who knows, maybe, like the sons of the prophets, you'll find yourself smiling later, sharing tales of how God made your own axe heads float, how He turned your rivers into places of wonder.